This is Duke University.
What I want to do tonight is to share a set of remarks and observations concerning some features of contemporary knowledge landscapes, in particular in the humanities. These are, I would like to do, mindful of the fact that all around us there is an acute sense of an unfolding crisis, a crisis that affects not only the university as an institution, but also the disciplines which constitute the foundations of modern knowledge. In the case of South Africa, where I have been, as Deborah said, working for the last 15 years, some of these challenges are clearly of a political nature. They have to do with profound and still unresolved questions of racial justice, have to do with the conditions under which the university, I use the university, but of course it's have to disassemble it. The university can be recognized as a truly common and public good. And the conditions under which it can be recognized as a microcosm of a society in which each voice counts, a society in which the idea of radical hospitality and co-belonging makes sense. So these are some of the political discussions going on as we speak. They have been going on for, I would say, the last few years. But some of the challenges to the humanities and to knowledge institutions such as a university are of a generational nature. If only we agree that significant cultural shifts are underway as we increasingly live our lives in reconfigured environments of intense informational stimuli. And as we know, digital technologies have become tightly woven into the fabric of everyday life, especially among the younger generations, where technologically enhanced rewiring of the brain, I think, is underway. And it is quite possible that an entirely different kind of human and an entirely different kind of self are emerging among the younger generations. It is possible that the university as an institution might be ill-prepared to, quote-unquote, educate them. So we witness those challenges on an everyday basis in Johannesburg at Wits University, where I work. Other challenges are of an institutional nature. By this I mean that not so long ago, institutionalized knowledge used to be all that counted. It was an object to be taught in clearly circumscribed institutions and disciplines. And as a matter of fact, there's no boundary for any knowledge today. Extra-institutional knowledge is unbounded, it is almost uncontainable, it's easily searchable, by which I mean is no longer so easily restricted by organizational apparatuses. Furthermore, as many have shown, to know nowadays requires the development of a range of new capacities in writing, in reading, in forms of public presentation, in interpreting images, or in working on the screen. And as a result, old knowledge platforms now appear increasingly dated, or in any case are falling fast into obsolescence. And this has an impact indeed on what the university is and what kinds of knowledges is it that we are imparting onto the students. Let me mention what seems to me to be, at least in our case in South Africa, another major challenge, this one of a pedagogical nature, and it is triggered by the fact that new learning methods and devices have been experimented with. I think here of the extent to which traditional ways of teaching are being challenged. They are changing too, thanks to a range of new practices and methods enabled by digital environments. So more and more students in our courses are contesting the student-teacher relationship, pushing for what they call horizontal learning, in which the teacher is not there to impart knowledge, where the classroom becomes a space of co-search and co-interrogation, community of learning, which involves the teacher as well, and a community of learning where relations of authority are, so to say, largely redistributed, are no longer monopolized by one who knows and facing a community of those who do not know. So these are some of the challenges that are going on. And they indicate at least one thing, that we have entered an epoch which is characterized by a massive speeding up, acceleration, which contrasts quite powerfully with the humanistic predisposition to slow down, to go monastic, if you want. And this has created a number of, it seems to me, it creates a lot of tensions in terms of what constitutes knowledge and how it is redistributed. This having been said, let me nevertheless hasten to add that these are not only times of crisis. These are also times of heightened curiosity and experimentation. And I would like to focus the rest of my talk on this aspect. Why is it the case that these are times of heightened curiosity and experimentation? This is the case because many, at least in South Africa and the rest of the continent, feel that our encounters with the world can no longer be explained by orthodox thinking. Many believe that conditions compel us to experiment with different images of thought and to create, hopefully, new concepts that will help us imagine a different existence in common. That the question of the university and the question of knowledge has to do with the possibility, the political possibility of imagining a different existence in common. That is what is at stake. And indeed, when we look around us, what strikes me the most is the emergence of new bodies of thought, the formation of new knowledge assemblages, and the extent to which most of these assemblages are pretty much in rupture with or are creatively building on the old disciplinary demarcations so typical of the modern university. Now, part of what characterizes these new bodies of thought or assemblages is the extent to which they are involved in rethinking almost everything. The nature of knowledge itself, the nature of being, the nature of matter, new conceptions of time, in particular deep time, or in any case, the geological recasting of historical time that has been precipitated by, among others, the Anthropocene, questions about the ways in which the human world should be reimagined culturally and politically in terms of its relation with the earth, or debates about the end of the human condition as marked by agency, wider questions, in any case, concerning the relation of human life to planetary life. I could go on and on, but all of these issues are the subject of a renewed discussion in a whole variety of platforms, most of which are not contained by the university as an institution. There's a huge reservoir of knowledge outside of the university institution, which is there, and some of the most exciting experiments in the humanities are actually going on at the interface of what we produce in the university and what is going on outside of our walls. But even within the university itself, a number of shifts are underway. And I would like to now to briefly comment on some of those shifts that have to do with the changing epistemological landscape. The first kind of shift that is going on has been going on for some time, but it seems to me that now it is reaching a level of acceleration it didn't have earlier on because of all I mentioned earlier on, the pressures and technological innovations that come with them. The first has to do with the fragmentation of the disciplines. Okay, we all know this, and not so long ago, the sciences, whether theoretical or practical, could still be systematically ordered. They could still be classified. For instance, life sciences, physics could be demarcated. They could be located among methodological axes, along a set of pedagogical practices, and so forth and so on. That was possible. And it is still possible to some extent. But the fact is that now, within every discipline and every field, the ramifications are so manifold that they tend to subvert any consistent totality. Each specialization ends up turning into further segmentations, which in turn branch out from their original roots in a process of incessant production of sub-specializations. I was Googling this afternoon. I was on Google trying to substantiate what I'm just saying and trying to find material to provide evidence to what I'm saying. And Google, Taylor, and Francis, the number of journals. You have today a journal for almost everything. And we haven't finished. I'm sure that in 10, 15 years, these numbers will be even bigger than we do have now. The proliferation of journals is a small indicator of the parcelization of disciplines I'm talking about, which makes it such that established disciplines, in fact, do no longer correspond to, they do no longer encompass the variety of fields of inquiry. So there is a profound disjuncture between the disciplinary taxonomies and classifications inherited from the 19th or even 20th centuries, and the current proliferation of thematic imagination, the rhythm of the constitution of diverse sub. We are living in an age of wide thematic imagination. Another indicator of the shifts I'm talking about has to do with the velocity of so-called turns. In the 80s, we had the linguistic turn. Nowadays, many turns are happening simultaneously. The affect turn, the new materialism turn, the ontological turn, the neuro turn. Some of the turns, of course, do not last. Others are really not real turns, since they do not affect deeper questions of epistemology, of method. A number of others are, as we know, part of the vast recycling and rebranding of disciplines that goes hand in hand with the creeping commodification of education. Now, the question we have to ask is, why all these terms? I think a crucial factor behind, let's say, the proliferation of fields and subfields of inquiry is the fact that entrenched and historic antagonisms between the sciences and humanities disciplines are, if not breaking down, at least not as rigid as they used to be. They are breaking down as a result of a number of developments I would like to briefly single out. First is the gradual recognition that we humans are not as special as we once thought. That simple statement, it seems to me, should open the door to a vast reinterrogation of what we call the humanities. Because the humanities in the modern university are founded on the belief, the fiction that we are very special. So, if now we come to realize that we are not as special as we once thought, then we cannot continue, humanities cannot operate as they used to. Their foundations are shaken fundamentally. This is their foundation. And, of course, for those who are interested in decoloniality, Walter is here, many others, there was a secondary, or if you want, not a central statement embedded in that early statement. Some are more special than others. So these two foundational statements, grounding solid ground on the basis of which the humanities have been imagined, have been assaulted, have been radically questioned over the last century, I would say, but even more so by the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the current century. Second is the fact that the humanities have traditionally relied on the distinction between society and nature, or culture and nature. And this is reflected, of course, in the division of labor between social sciences and natural sciences. The social being usually referred to, let's say the social referring usually to those aspects of human life, activities and understanding, which require some form or another of symbolization. Of course, then nature being understood to encompass both subjects and objects, society and nature nevertheless denoting two realms that could be kept or in any case, we thought could be kept analytically distinct. The distinction between the symbolic, the pre-symbolic, and so forth and so on. Now, of course, there are still those who argue for the uniqueness of human nature, for the idea that humans occupy a unique position in the scheme of things. They still believe, for instance, that humans alone are capable of rational thought. They alone have a capacity to feel emotions such as empathy, etc. There are still many who believe that. But the so-called ontological turn, which has given rise to new subfields such as post-humanist ethnography, environmental philosophy and history, earth systems science, and other strands of social science research, that and the so-called multi-species turn have brought under severe stress such beliefs. And common to these subfields is the idea of distributed agency, and to some extent the rejection of the Cartesian dichotomies between subject and object, society and nature, human and non-human, and so forth and so on. The drive today, in one word, is to perceive as sources of agency the various non-human entities with which we interact. That age of entanglement, if you want. So, what do the humanities, what does the practice of the humanities mean in an age of entanglement is the new question around which a number of experimentations are going on. I could say more about the neuroturn. I won't, except to say that a number of key categories of the humanities inquiry are in fact being subjected to renewed interrogation, especially by the life and biological sciences. What we thought was typical of us is now the object of investigation, if not colonization, by other sciences. I could make some other comments on the subjects of cognition. The fact that cognition itself is no longer limited to humans or organisms with consciousness. The recognition of the fact that cognition is also pervasive in complex technical systems. The fact that knowledge does not only reside in the brain, it's also acquired through interactions with the environment, all that is going on in the field of epigenetics. But let me mention one aspect of the current shift that seems to me to be really important is the return to big questions. The most important of which are what constitutes human life? How are we to communicate between disciplines, between cultures, between human and non-human entities, point I was making earlier on, whether there is anything we hold dear in our ways of living that we might want to preserve, nurture, and foster, while overcoming the existential paradigm that has set us on a fast track to ecological collapse. So there are a set of big questions such as these that are back on the agenda. So overall, it seems to me that a renewed dialogue is in the making between the social sciences, studies of science and technology, health systems, life and biological sciences, and philosophy. Of course, this dialogue is not without tensions and contradictions. But this incipient convergence seems to me to be part of, let's see, what is going on. Now, let me move on and add a few other aspects of these thematically and conceptual imagination that has been putting us in front of new questions. Let me mention in that sense one other challenge that has to do with the advent of algorithmic thinking and various forms of automated reasoning in an age when machines are more and more endowed with decision-making capacities, including the face of paradoxical propositions. It seems to me that the concretization of reasoning in machines, which is a major event of our times, this concretization of reasoning in machines, their increasing capacity to incorporate modes of logical thinking, all of this has cast a shadow on deductive reasoning. It has also cast a shadow on the uniqueness of human reasoning. The humanities are premised on that idea once again. Biologically bounded thought has been displaced or is being displaced by an abstract architecture of reasoning able to carry out tasks and make decisions by correlating data. This is part of what is currently going on. And it seems to me that, on the other hand, the production of massive amounts of data at exponential rates has paved the way for diverse practices of numeracy, quantitative inquiry, and software analytics. And therefore, a different ontology of numbers is in the making. That's the point I really want to make, that numbers are no longer what we thought they were. An entirely different ontology of numbers is in the making. They are no longer just the engines of calculation or even of computation. They are fast also becoming the engines of invention, imagination, and speculation. We used to think that they were not. More and more, in fact, there is a fusion between all these different functions early on adjudicated to numbers. So, these new knowledge assemblages, I have just given you a telegraphic image of these. Of course, they have not emerged out of nowhere. They are the result of key intellectual events that have helped reconfigure contemporary knowledge landscapes. And of these key events, I would like to single out three. There are many more, but three seem to me to have absolutely been critical to this reconstitution of knowledge landscapes in our time. Let me mention first the intensification of the critique of the foundational assumptions of so-called Western thought. A critique both internal to Western thought and external to it. What are some of these foundational assumptions? For instance, nature is fixed and measurable. We now discover that is really not the case, or it's only partly the case. Another foundational assumption, material objects act only when acted upon by an external agent. We discover now that that is not exactly the case. Another assumption, humans have a separate existence from the world, which allows them to become masters of the universe. We are discovering that this is not entirely true. So we have had an intensification of that critique that has been directed at the ontological grounds on which the dichotomies which have been part of Western ways of thinking have been made or continue to be made today. And once again, interestingly enough, some of this critique comes from within so-called Western thought itself. I insist on this because where I work, it's the decolonization in turn. And we are in the midst of something called decolonization. We have to decolonize everything. A vulgar understanding of the decolonization injunction is to say, okay, we really don't want to read so and so. We don't want to read Hegel; he makes us uncomfortable. We don't want to read even Marx, Freud. That's really, don't want to go there. And you ask students, okay, why don't you want to read Marx, Freud, or Hegel? And they tell you, give you the reasons I have just given to you. I have just given you. So who do you want to read? I want to read Frantz Fanon. Okay. Do you know who Frantz Fanon used to read? Who he was in conversation with? No. Okay, he was in conversation with Marx. He was in conversation with Hegel, whom you can stand. He was in conversation with Freud, Lacan, Merleau-Ponty, so forth and so on. How on earth will you be able to read Fanon if you excise those he was in conversation with? So it's a model of, say, injunction to decolonize that imagines that you can partition knowledge, texts, basically. You can read Nkrumah or Cabral without dealing with the historical context that shaped his own thought. And this kind of model is premised on the idea that Western thought is one entity. It's not really itself an instance of contradiction. Anyway, the critique of these dichotomies has helped in paving the way for the new experimentations we are witnessing. The second event has been a substantive reinterrogation of the category of the human. Various attempts at decentering the human, at replacing the human within a broader multi-species history, history of forms of life and of living entities. There's a third event that has paved the way for the kind of experimentation we are witnessing today. It is the at times acrimonious debate about the normativity of the human sciences in general. And here again, the decolonial turn, or decolonization injunction, is part of this old debate. What is that debate? The debate is this. If indeed critique is not merely descriptive, if it is concerned also with judging, differentiating, and deciding, what norms does it presuppose? That has been the question. And it's an old question. It's really not new. It means it has reached South Africa of late, but it's a question the so-called non-Western world has been dealing with for a long time, and it's a question the West itself, in its various philosophical traditions, has been dealing with. So where do these norms come from? Where do they come from? The debate is that how does an internal critique, one that emanates from within, one that is based on indigenous concepts and categories, one which is, if you want, internal to the object, immanent to the object, how does it differ from an external one? Meaning one whose yardstick is outside the object being criticized. That is the big controversy going on in, not only in South Africa, but I mean parts of France, wherever you not in, but in Europe, for instance, where minority scholars are emerging. You have these questions being posed. The assumption here is that, at least in the case of South Africa and other parts of the continent, the idea is that a truly decolonial critique or decolonized critique is one that should develop its own forms and its own norms out of the movement of the object itself. The presupposition is that there does not exist any critique that would be context transcending. That's what it is. So the conflict, because there's a conflict going on, is between those who believe this and those who believe that there's room for a different kind of critique that could be, let me say, genealogical. That in fact, Fanon, Cabral, Nkrumah can be the subject of a critique that recognizes and takes seriously the multiple genealogies of what it is that they produced. And such a critique would be, if not context transcending, at least context related, let's say, would put together, would relate multiple contexts, which is absolutely true. When Fanon writes Black Skin, White Mask, there's evidence of his belonging to many different intellectual traditions. So how is it that these many different traditions coexist in what looks like a single discourse, becomes in and of itself a very interesting object of study? Or you want to make sense of this text, we cannot elide it or excise it from, let's say, these multiple genealogies. So, as we speak, these are the two, let's say, the kind of confrontation that is going on in our world. So, let me end this by simply adding one or two little things that are part of that debate. Let's say a different formulation of it. The big division right now is between basically those who believe that there are serious risks in framing humanity in an undifferentiated whole. Those who believe that we must resist the way the human and the world have been constituted as one, because the way the human and the world have been constituted as one has carried with it too much violence, and therefore what we have to pay attention to are the multiple social worlds, fractured, contested, that allow us to make room for a multiplicity of voices and perspectives, that we have to replace univocality with multivocality as a way of refusing to perpetuate the knowledge power asymmetries that currently fracture global humanity. Have that is a point that is made very powerfully and which is captured by the injunction to decolonize. So that, and on the other hand, as I said, those who would like to articulate a critique that would be somewhat a bit more hospitable to the idea, if not of the human as one, at least of the planetary. The planetary here being a bit more than just the globe, which as we know refers to the human-dominated surface of the Earth. The planetary aiming at capturing, in this case, the co-evolution of the natural and the social worlds, and the deep historical time of planetary life in an integrated history of the Earth system and the human world. So that's where we are. And this fight is far from being resolved. I just wanted to report on it. Thank you very much.
It seems to me that on one level you have presented this moment in which the humanities has to change dramatically given these three different factors. And yet it also seems, rather in the way that people used to say that as soon as you start talking about the animal, you have a recentering of the human, that in some ways both your options that you come up with at the end are about a certain recentering of the human, either the notion of the human in general, or indeed a differentiated humanity with that has suffered various forms or enjoyed various forms of the consequences of violence. So I just wanted you to maybe comment on this question of how it is that paradoxically there's a kind of recentering of the human that is encapsulated in that question that you said, I think, was one of the most important ones that emerges now, is how do we understand human life today?
You capture the dilemma very dramatically. In the sense that whatever path we seem to be taking, we seem to be saddled by the human, basically. That it seems as if, not that we want to get rid of the human, but it just doesn't seem to be a way in which a radical decentering of the human might be possible. Personally, I believe that we can go a long way, let's say, in restituting the human to, or let's say in eliciting, first of all, the very different positions the human has occupied in the multiple archives of the world. Because if I take, for instance, if I take seriously a certain number of traditions of African systems of thought, some of which have been properly documented by both historians, anthropologists, and other disciplines. It's possible to say something about them today. If I take that other archive of the world, let's say it doesn't give me about the human the kind of discourse we hear from, let's say, let's just use that term, Western thought. Once again, from within Western thought, there are many different instantiations. It doesn't give me a world in which is built around, let's say, dichotomies. A huge part of modern thought cannot operate without dichotomies. It's full of them. What would happen if we pronounce a moratorium on dichotomies, for instance? Let's just imagine that. Moratorium, 1 year, policing, no dichotomies. Would we think differently? What resources would we find, let's say, in quote-unquote Western archive that would allow us to think? Or is it that thought itself would be crippled? Critique would come to a standstill. Now, going back to African systems of thought, for instance, the key question, there are always in every archive, some key interrogations. The key foundational interrogation is not about ontology. Being and time, being and this, being and that. Hegel, Heidegger, Sartre. Being and something else. It's not about ontology, it's about relation. It's about composition. How is it that what we call the human, in fact, is a composite of multiple forces, vital beings and entities? How agency is the capacity indeed to orchestrate all these agencies, some of them material, others purely immaterial, and how to be a human is to be in search constantly of a supplement to who one is. That it has to do with becoming, but even more than that, becoming other. It's not about becoming me, it's about becoming other, a little bit of Deborah, a little bit of Charlie, a little bit of David, sorry. It's like that, and building it in a compositional manner to produce something that is constantly metamorphosizing. So it's a different kind of archive, and I think it allows us to somewhat attenuate the dilemmas we face in constantly recentering the human in the process by which we aim at decentering the human. So what I'm advocating is a methodology that takes seriously all the archives of the world in an attempt at indeed playing them against each other and creating a tension that might not solve entirely the issue, but that might help us to frame those issues differently. And it's very urgent to do that. The urgency of doing that couldn't be stressed enough. So a university that wants to produce knowledge for the future will have to take that task very, very seriously.
I was just wondering, and I think you put it wonderfully, this kind of dilemma that happens with being and, right? And this kind of constant creation of these dichotomies, even when we're trying to, decenter the human, we've once again recentered it by creating that very dichotomy in the first place, and, infinitely regressing in that way. And I was wondering, one thought that I did have that may be another vocabulary that can be brought into this when you're talking about alternative archives or a plurality of archives is this kind of the theory of like the generic, right? So I'm thinking, specifically about like Francois Laruelle and these kinds of conversations around an object that doesn't necessarily need to have like a subject or a predicate. So it would just be somehow just being, not even being and, right? So some kind of univocity or univocal being that's also like, a plural kind of being at the same time. And I'm just curious if you've thought about that in relation to your work, and if that is something that can be useful in rethinking these dilemmas.
I mean, I haven't thought about it systematically, but I have been forced to, because of the pressure we are in. I mean, all that I'm saying here is very predetermined by the ongoing struggles in South Africa and other parts of the continent, but I'm sure that in other regions of the world you can see them unfolding too. So as we are forced by the times to respond to the injunction to decolonize, I personally have found a renewed interest in, let's say, these archives I was talking about. Some of them are written, others are not at all, yet they are there. And in exploring them, or in trying to rely on the analysis of those who have studied them, one of the key things that stand out is what I was talking about a moment ago. The discovery that, first of all, the question of being is might not be in, let's say, the most important one for everybody. Where it is important might be framed in many different ways. For instance, what is the real? What does it mean to see, for instance? Perception, questions of perception. What is it to perceive? What lies behind what we see? The whole question of the visible, the whole question of difference, in relation not simply to individuality, but to gemelity. I don't know whether that's a term that exists in English, but here I'm referring to the work of Marcel Griol, for instance, among the Dogon, where the question of difference, which is so central to has been absolutely key to our discussions since the beginning of the century, is really, it's resolved differently, in a different manner, if we understand that in the Dogon cosmology, the conjoining of two entities that look opposite is the normal way in which to think being. It's not to say there's one entity that is autonomous and another one that is, and then we try to see what's going on when you bring them together. Is that being is foundationally, by definition, the coming together and the structuring of two poles that apparently look entirely opposite. If we take seriously the concept of gemelity, which comes from twins, the idea of twinning, that twinning, the real is being has to do with twinning. What is the impact of such, can be the impact of such an approach on a reconsideration of gender, for instance? I believe that In fact, there's still a huge scope using the African archive to say something entirely new about theories of sexual difference. We haven't even begun. And that's the next project. Writing a small book on sexual difference using the African material. So if you want, this is where some of the ongoing discussions lead us. So at least some of us.
We're practicing and defending the humanities without wanting to say that the human is something other than a recognition of the value of a kind of caring, a kind of attention, a kind of desire to preserve and activate. But I constantly find myself thinking around language of humanistic or humanities that the implicit defense, it's not explicit, the implicit defense of the human as something different from non-human primates and from all of the other creatures, cells, and the environment that we're increasingly engaged with in the humanities is a serious stumbling block in our field, in the real definition of where we want to go. And yet, being led off into knowledge about things like motor abstraction, which is a new theory in neuroscience, that the kind of mirroring and imitation that occurs between one primate or human primate watching other primates and potentially other animals' gestures, bringing of food to the mouth, moving through space, that this really is, in the end, incredibly difficult to separate from the genesis of abstract thought. And we're seeing increasing defenses of the idea of language and cognition, as you said, in cellular processes, in organic, but in organic plant life. And then there's the book Unthought by Kate Hales, where she, in very strict terms, studies everything that relates to our assumption that cognition is specifically human. And all of this to say that I think that you've put your finger on a fundamental anxiety and motivator for both profound new exploration, new curiosity, and the proliferation of subspecialties, the parcelization of our fields, and the parcelization of our time, which does go against that caring and that attention and that desire and appreciation and forces of preservation and activation. So I think that what you're getting at here is very important, and there is an increasing body of work that's emerging around it and challenging us all to, I think, also be open as humanities faculty, students, people in the public who identify with humanities products and processes, that this is a way that we are a field in which thought is troubled. There was a Humanities Futures conference by the philosophy department a couple of weeks ago about theory of mind. And there was a very brilliant cognitive neuroscientist there, along with several philosophical theorists of mind. And it became clear that the neuroscientist was really disagreeing with a lot of the presuppositions of theory of mind. And I eventually asked if it isn't just long overdue to do a major epistemic reevaluation of theory of mind, because mind in the Anglophone tradition is really considered sort of coterminous with discourses of brain and of human individuality, rationality, etc. And yet, in many languages and traditions, it's much more connected to inspiration and breathing, to spirit, to ritual processes, to wit, to humor, interactive, individual, group, mimetic bonds. And to, I think, all of our surprise, she agreed wholeheartedly with that. And a lot of her work is her lab deals particularly with infants. And she pointed out just the many ways in which their study of infants, toddlers, young children, then get sort of attached to fields that are assuming that we're talking about this particular conception of the adult rational thinker. So anyhow, I just am trying to think with you here. It's and if I could think of a specific question that comes out of that, I guess it would be, do you think that the ways that your students are asking for that refocusing of the pedagogical space does provide an important sort of road marker as to how to proceed methodologically?
See, so there's on the one hand the demand that is coming from them for an entirely different knowledge project that is very tightly related to a politics of a life in common. Under what conditions is it that we can live together? And under what conditions it is that we can therefore recognize that we owe something to each other. The political being the attempt at articulating and deciphering what that it is. What is it that we owe to each other? Or is it that we really don't owe each other anything? I think that those are some of the questions they are asking when they say pedagogy, when they say knowledge, when they say decolonization. But that's my interpretation. That's how I understand it. And on the other hand, as I was saying, and you too, we live in a moment when various forces seem to be coalescing to force the human to confront two things. On the one hand, to confront its own powers, and on the other hand, its own smallness. That's what humans are forced at this time to confront, because of all kinds of reasons. And to confront them with respect to powers and forces of the universe that we occupy, which includes, all the species you were mentioning. Or if not to do that, at least to reinterrogate our connections with the things that compose our world, especially at a time when the world seems to become more and more unlivable. How to rediscover the fact that we are ourselves anything but these connections. that our relations to non-humans are to some extent what make us human. It seems to me we can reformulate those issues. I'm trying to reformulate them here in a language I'm more familiar with. But what I want to highlight is the political dimension of these kinds of discussions. That they are not simply about kind of knowledge that would be separate from the challenges of the day. Thank you.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.